When Winnie-the-Pooh, Blood and Honey was announced, the idea sounded like either the beginning of something special or one of the biggest gimmicks in horror. Taking beloved childhood characters and turning them into horror villains is such a simple but fascinating concept. We grew up seeing these characters as symbols of innocence, friendship, and nostalgia, so the idea of taking those same characters and twisting them into something dark naturally caught people's attention. And that's how the Twisted Childhood universe was born. But after watching the first few movies, I think a lot of people started asking themselves the same question. Was this universe actually going somewhere, or was it just a collection of famous childhood characters turned into killers? Because while the concept was always interesting, the execution wasn't always there. The first three movies had moments of potential, but they also felt like they were trying to figure out what this universe actually wanted to be. Looking back now, I don't think those early movies failed because the filmmakers lacked ambition. I think they were so focused on proving that these childhood characters could work in horror that they forgot to ask what made these stories worth adapting in the first place. Then something changed. With Bambi, The Reckoning, and Pinocchio Unstrung, the franchise stopped feeling like it was relying on the novelty of childhood characters turned into killers and started feeling like actual horror adaptations. And that's where I think the Twisted Childhood universe finally found its footing. Let's start with where it all began. Winnie-the-Pooh, Blood and Honey. I actually think the original idea behind this movie is better than people give it credit for, because the movie does take something meaningful from the original story. The original Winnie-the-Pooh is about friendship, childhood innocence, and Christopher Robin's bond with the characters of the 100-Acre Wood. So what happens if Christopher Robin grows up and leaves them behind? That's actually a pretty dark idea. Instead of these characters representing childhood comfort, what if being forgotten and abandoned corrupted them? The problem is that the movie mostly uses that idea as an explanation for why Pooh and Piglet become killers instead of really exploring the emotional tragedy behind it. The foundation is there. The movie just doesn't build on it. Instead, it becomes more focused on the shock value of seeing Winnie the Pooh as a horror villain than exploring what that abandonment actually meant for the characters. The idea was there. The movie just didn't fully understand how to use it. Then we got Winnie-the-Pooh, Blood and Honey 2. And I think this movie deserves more credit than it usually gets. It stopped relying solely on the original gimmick and started trying to build something bigger. It introduced more mythology, expanded the world, and even introduced the idea of Christopher Robin having a twin brother connected to Pooh. For the first time, it felt like the filmmakers wanted this to become an actual franchise instead of just a one-off horror movie. But bigger ideas don't automatically make a better film. It still felt like the franchise was experimenting and trying to figure out what worked and what didn't. It was definitely an improvement, but it still feels like the Twisted Childhood universe hadn't completely discovered its direction yet. Then came in Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare. And this one was another interesting step because it showed the franchise wasn't afraid to experiment with different styles of horror. Instead of simply asking, what if Peter Pan was a killer, the movie explored darker ideas connected to the character. The fear of never growing up, the obsession with keeping children trapped in a fantasy, the darker side of childhood innocence. Those are all ideas that can absolutely work in a horror. But this movie also highlighted the biggest challenge of adapting these characters. Because while it had elements of Peter Pan, it didn't always feel like a twisted version of Neverland. A lot of what makes Peter Pan memorable comes from the mythology surrounding him. Neverland, the Lost Boys, Captain Hook, that strange feeling of a place where children never grow up. The movie had interesting ideas, but it focused more on Peter as a grounded horror villain instead of fully embracing the fantasy world that made the original story so iconic. It wasn't necessarily the wrong direction, but it showed the Twisted Childhood universe was still searching for the right balance between honoring the source material and creating something new. And that's where Bambi the Reckoning feels like the turning point, because instead of asking, How do we make this childhood character scary? It asks, what was already unsettling about this story that we can transform into horror? And for me, that's where the franchise finally starts finding its identity. People may disagree, but Bambi the Reckoning is where things really turned around. Visually, this movie feels like a major step forward. Even though Bambi is CGI, I think the design works because it makes him feel like an actual creature instead of simply a horror version of a recognizable character. The antlers, the size, the way the movie frames him, everything about him feels intimidating. But what really makes this movie work isn't just the visuals. It's how it uses the source material. The original Bambi is a story about nature and humanity's impact on the natural world. The biggest representation of that is man, who brings death and destruction into the forest. Bambi's world is peaceful, but that peace is constantly threatened by humanity. The Reckoning takes that idea and exaggerates it. Humans don't just threaten animals anymore. Their actions poison the environment and create a monster. This movie takes the original question, what happens when humans disturb the natural world, and transformed it into what happens when nature fights back. This is an important distinction. Bambi isn't simply scary because he's killing people. He's scary because he represents nature's taking revenge on humanity. That's what separates this later movie from the early entries. They're no longer just making childhood characters violent. They're turning original themes into horror. And then we get to Pinocchio Unstrung, and this movie proves that Bambi wasn't just a lucky exception. Once again, the movie doesn't simply ask, what if Pinocchio was evil? It takes the original story and twists the ideas that were already there. Geppetto still creates Pinocchio, but the reason behind it is much darker. After losing James's friend, he creates someone who will never leave him. Someone who will never die. Pinocchio still wants to become a real boy, just like in the original story. But the horror comes from how that dream is fulfilled. Instead of becoming human through kindness, honesty, and proving himself, he believes becoming human requires harvesting parts from actual people. It's disturbing, it's grotesque, but it works because the movie isn't randomly making Pinocchio a monster. It's asking, what if the desire to become human became something horrifying? That makes Pinocchio feel tragic before he feels monstrous. And that's exactly what the earlier movies were missing. Another thing I noticed in the later movies, that they understand the tone much better. The earlier films sometimes felt like they were trying so hard to convince audiences that they needed to be taken seriously. And that's a difficult balance when your premise is literally evil Winnie-the-Pooh or a killer Peter Pan. The newer movies feel much more confident. They still deliver the horror, but they aren't afraid to have fun with the absurdity of the concept. They embrace the fact that turning childhood icons into horror monsters is a ridiculous idea. They're not making parodies. They're simply confident enough not to fight against the premise. And I think that confidence makes the movies more enjoyable. At the end of the day, I don't think the Twisted Childhood universe improved simply because the effects got better or because the budgets got bigger. I think it improved because the filmmakers finally started to understand what made these stories memorable in the first place. The early movies asked, how do we make childhood characters scary? But the newer movies started asking, what was already haunting about these stories? And the franchise started answering that question. And that's when it became something more than just a gimmick. Because the horror doesn't simply come from something familiar and simply making it violent. It comes from finding the darkness that was already there. Alright, y'all, that's all I got for this one. Be sure to comment. Let me know what you thought about this video. Let me know if you agree or disagree. And if you think the Twisted Childhood universe is getting better. Be sure to like and subscribe. And I'll see you on the next one.